Webinar on privileged access management in the modern cloud. Today is all about privilege, how it's evolved, and how to secure it. I'm James Casagrande from Sonrai Security, and I'll be your moderator today. If you don't know Sonrai, we are all about total control of permissions in your cloud. We've been working in the public cloud, securing IAM for a number of years in AWS, Azure, GCP. Today's conversation really focused mainly in AWS, but applies across the public cloud. Joining me today is Sonrai Security's head of product, Matt Carl. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing great, James. Thank you.
And there's your face. So Matt's been working on securing things for a long time. He's been at IBM. He's been at a number of different very interesting jobs through in the defense world and the cybersecurity world. And you've really been passionate about how misunderstood privilege is in the cloud and how it's impacted not only security folks, but also software development organizations. And, it's just this confluence of factors that we're going to talk about today that have caused this. So the change of privilege in generally RBAC cloud, the flaws of the attempts to fix sort of privilege today. Then we're going to get into, privilege centric versus identity centric, this concept where we're trying to get people to understand about how the identity centric legacy of PAM and how we want to move towards a privilege centric approach. And then we'll show you a little bit about our quote unquote permissions firewall, which is the Sonrai Cloud Permissions Firewall. It's not an actual firewall of networks traffic, but it is something that is the same concept around privilege and being able to secure that sort of in the same way. So we're going to dive into all this and to also take your questions at the end. If we don't get to any, we'll absolutely respond to them over email. But I think a good place to start is to talk about just, what's changed and why are we talking about privilege access management today? Well, we all know we have a bit of a problem with it, and we'll talk about the scale of that problem in a second. We have some research we want to show you, but before we get there, I think it's important to say how we got here. And I think it's a fairly simple story from my end is, there's two different things. It's number one, it was identity creation was democratized and identities are created all the time. And whether it's third-party vendors or you're getting a role to execute whatever you need in your cloud, whether it's many different development teams who need to create identities quickly in order to launch workloads, if you're responsible for a cloud or you're on a platform team or security team or cloud ops team, you're just going to see a lot of net new identities created all of the time. So it's just how we use cloud, but it's also sort of the proscribed RBAC model that the cloud providers have provided to us. In AWS, for example, you're supposed to create redundant roles at some point, right? You should be treating whether it's an org or an account as a sort of security boundary, and you're going to have a role that does the exact same thing in one space that functions the same way and is used by the same people or same workloads in a different place. So it's really just was an inevitability. And this is where I tend to say, it's not your fault, right? That privilege sort of just sprung up everywhere. And it really it's not because, people love to say, oh, we took data center principles into the cloud or whatever. No, this is stuff just from what I call cloud 1.0, right? This was the way we thought we should run cloud. We just didn't know we would get to this level of scale. And as we'll see, to the machine identity explosion of the past 10 years or so. Matt, this is sort of the color on the scale of the problem, but I know there's a lot more underneath as well that's changed with that you've seen helping people secure privilege access in the cloud. What's your take on sort of what's changed so far?
I think when I engage with customers, one of the things that's been pretty prevalent is customers have been exceptionally successful at using the cloud the way it was intended to be used. The
Mhm.
cloud is exceptionally dynamic, a lot of ephemerality when it comes to workloads, services. I use something today, I don't use it tomorrow. Right. So everything that you've mentioned is absolutely true, but it all hinges on the fact that the cloud itself was built to allow us this dynamic nature of existence, our ability to create workloads, use them, throw them away. Right. And so every time we do these types of things, we move into the realms of, completely serverless computing, lambda based serverless functions running containers, all of these types of things. They all still in the cloud do require an identity. And this is where you get that explosion of identity. So the change in the actual ecosystem and the way the cloud actually works has driven what we've seen from a privilege perspective and how privilege exists in a cloud. Um, the other things that are interesting are just the way the cloud actually functions. We'll talk a little bit later about privilege looks different. um, we come from a world, and even in clouds, we still see certain customers trying to prescribe to this. I know my perimeter. I know my administrators. I know where privilege is. The cloud kind of breaks all those rules. And, where, I used to be able to define, and I still can kind of, but you have to be kind of real good with the individual cloud control plane mechanisms to actually satisfy this. This should not be able to do this thing because I've controlled it at the network layer. Well, the clouds kind of broke all of that, and if I can call it API, I can get that thing to happen. And more cloud advanced organizations truly have adopted the fact that the perimeter doesn't exist anymore. And we have this nebulous entity that is this set of compute and set of identities that are delivering my services. And within that, we just see this explosion of workloads, this explosion of permissions and privilege, which I think you're going to get to. So that to me is sort of the underpinnings of why we've arrived where we are. You've certainly done a great job at highlighting certainly the explosion of the identity problem itself, but we'll dig in a bit here as we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to put numbers to it, right? So we do some proprietary research around organizations or clouds in mainly North America. These numbers, I think, are from 2023, but they hold true today. It's pretty staggering the amount of identities that are in an average cloud, but also the amount of identities that are simply have excessive privileges in the cloud. So 92% of identities have excessive permissions that they're just simply not using, and a ton of those permissions are sensitive, as we'll see in a second. And then, of course, 61% of all identities just have never been used ever before. So that's where overprivilege comes in, where we're simply just over provisioning so much. And the vast majority of it is machine identities, right? So that's where it's not tied to a human in any way. And, we like to say we use these three words to describe the state of privilege access: complex, overprivileged, and broken. We call it broken just because it seems like we've made it impossible to fix. Because when you think about, all right, I've got one overprivileged identity, right? And let's say you had, even if you had just 1,000 of them, what are you going to do to fix that overprivileged identity today? Technically, it might not be a hard problem to describe. Oh, there's an identity-based policy that I need to edit, and it's a simple JSON statement, right? And it's just a couple lines of code. But really, the time investment to solve that problem is things that are outside of a technical problem. They are, well, who owns that identity? Is it this team over here? Have you ever worked with that team before? Do you know who to talk to on that team? Um, do you know what the intended use of that identity is? Is that a break glass sort of function that that identity needs to keep, even though it's unused? And just that coordination, right? To find the right team, to find the right use case, and then also then to deploy, right? You might be the person responsible for fixing that identity or controlling privilege, but you might not have the ability to deploy the fix. All of a sudden, you're dealing with a conservative estimate of like, yeah, it's going to take me 30 minutes of work to fix an identity. Okay, well, here's 10,000 of them. So, and that's, the average identities in a corporate cloud, I think our actual numbers, 11,500 something. So that becomes an intractable scale problem, right? And it's just a time element. We simply will never fix the cloud in the time that before it changes again. And that's just the side of us as cloud users, right, creating scale. Matt, I know you and our research team understand on the just what the cloud providers are building and how much new services and new infrastructure is actually contributing to scale problems as well with just the sheer number of permissions. So tell us more
Absolutely.
about that.
Well, one number on the screen, 18,911. This is the accurate number of AWS permissions. I think it was yesterday. When I started here at Sonrai 3 years ago, that was actually in the realm of about 13,000. So you can see the scale at which, or the velocity at which we create new permissions. Some people might be surprised by the 10,000 plus. That's, again, if it takes me 30 minutes to fix an identity, I can actually create 5 more in that same 30-minute period, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things that we've seen as clouds evolve, especially as you get into enterprise, but even in smaller clouds, right? Um, Thousands, tens of thousands of identities. These are real numbers. We're not talking, especially when you come from a privileged perspective. When you sort of take the legacy PAM approach, people will be like, "Why are we talking about this? We're talking about PAM." Right? We're only worried about the privileged identities. Well, these a lot of these are privileged. We see 90,000 overprivileged identities using really, really risky privilege, or having really risky privileges in the cloud that do not use them at all. 90,000. This is a big cloud, but 90,000. And how did we get here? I mean, the days of privileged management, when we sort of harken back to how a lot is thought about this space, I'd go to Bob and the IAM team and get my next identity that I needed, which would be according to some spec that I had to provide. That's not how it works anymore. I don't go to Bob anymore to get the instance profile role that I'm going to use on the EC2 instance to actually do my ETL orchestration. That ain't going to happen. In fact, I'm going to have the developer who's in charge of that process, or that procedure that needs to execute, building those identities and pushing them to the cloud. And there's if anybody on this call has ever worked with their developers or are developers themselves, these next two sentences are probably close to your heart, right? This permission needs that permission, which needs this other permission. That's very common, right? The sheer fact that I need A means I need C and D, right? And that's just the realities of how the clouds work. And it's not even that I will do C if I do A. That's a different sentence. It is, in order to do A, I need C. And because of that, we end up granting a lot of permissions. We see that 18,911. We think that's great. I can make really granular, correct policies. It's actually not as great as it might feel, because I needed A, therefore I gave it C and D. And oh, by the way, at the same time, if I'm going to call A, I'm probably going to call X and Y and Z. So I'm going to give it those as well. And so we end up with all of this permission being granted. And there's a dirty secret in any model, old or new. Workloads work perfectly fine with more permission than they need. They don't work very well with not enough permission. And so you can see what happens is we give more in order to get things to work, because we're motivated to move forward. We're more motivated to deliver. And that's how we end up in this state of thousands of identities with a whole lot of privilege. And we'll talk about what does privilege look like here in a second. It does look different, right? Go ahead,
Yeah.
James.
And, to be clear, we're the ones who asked for these permissions, right? We asked the cloud service providers. We said, give
We
us more
do.
services, give us more services, right? And said, okay. And now AWS has 300 services or something like that. And that's
Absolutely.
that's what's driving this. So, okay, so we've talked, a little bit about what's changing cloud in general. We've talked about the state of identity in general, just narrowing in on privilege access management, right? And why it's not working. And what Matt was referring to earlier about, talking about privilege specifically. Well, this is our chart here. This is from the same research set, right? So not only are most identities are machine identities in your cloud, but most of them have been granted what we're going to get it call sensitive permissions, which we're going to get into in a second. So there is absolutely just an explosion of privilege. And, most of the time when you're talking to people about privilege access management, they're going to bring up something like vaulting. They're going to bring up how they're securing their admin accounts. They're going to bring up things that sound like they're securing a few human identities that don't really address this larger problem here. So, it, and that's really gets into like, all right, so why did this sort of thinking fail? Why didn't this scale to or adapt to sort of this new type of cloud we have today, Matt? And you've talked to it. Talked a little bit about like how traditional PAM is about securing the known. I think that's a really good sort of phrase. But tell us more about how that approach doesn't really apply to this type of cloud.
if we keep it at the thinking level, again, when we engage on a PAM topic with organizations, often we do encounter IAM teams from the perspective of, I create the identities, I know what they have, I grant their privilege, I give them to the people that need them. But a lot of this thinking comes from the perspective of predictability, human controlled. These are words that we hear. I mean, or words that really resonate in that sort of traditional thinking. Is the cloud predictable? The cloud will do exactly what you ask it to do, but you have to remember you've moved into a world where you have hundreds of developers working in a lot of these clouds. You have hundreds of teams functioning in some of these larger clouds doing things. Are they human controlled? Even that's arguably not correct. We have a lot of non-humans actually creating the cloud through terraforming and infrastructure as code runs. So we get a lot of identities created that do things. And then, in fact, there's this weird separation between, in some organizations, we see some teams responsible for creating the identities, other teams responsible for building the code that actually uses the identities. We also have this weird separation between, I'm just working over here building my application. Yes, I need these permissions, without really truly understanding that that's going to result in an identity that's going to run in the cloud with all of these permissions, right? And could get accessed. So really, this design for predictability is a legacy concept. The cloud just breaks a lot of these rules. And it's not as easy to wrap your head around and understand what is known anymore. Some of these clouds have hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts, right? Who knows what's going on in this whole ecosystem? It's nearly impossible. I did mention privilege doesn't look the same. For those of you that use Identity Center in AWS or any of your sort of traditional PAM tools, you probably do have this concept of administrators or people that are highly privileged. Sure, every single individual in that administrator access permission set is privileged. That one's easy. And we'll show you how easy it is to control those in a modern cloud world versus extra tooling. But what about this serverless function that runs that can create its own serverless functions and pass roles to it? Is that privileged or is it not? It's only got 4 or 5 permissions. Is it privileged? It absolutely is privileged. And that's the definition. The definition of privilege has changed dramatically. Of 18,911 things, certainly not all of them are privileged. They all do something. They all relate to some capability, but privilege is now strewn across 430 plus services in AWS, 350 plus services in Azure, and a similar number in GCP. And those permissions grant access or capabilities to do things. It's no longer centralized. I don't have to worry about the 12 people. Yeah, I probably do have 12 people that I should be concerned with, but there's thousands upon thousands of identities that can do fantastic things that you need them to do, but also could be used against you if you're not controlling that access. Federation, third parties, non-humans. Again, in AWS and similar in most of these clouds, you're one line away from letting an entirely separate entity into your cloud with access to your most sensitive things, right? One change in one policy lets a third party in to read, write, do whatever they need to do. Understanding that access is, it's a cloud thing. It's a modern cloud thing. It's not a traditional PAM thing. And that really does flow into the next one of siloing humans and non-humans. We see this all the time. We see this whole slew of non-human solutions on the market. We see PAM solutions on the market. These are identities in cloud with access to permissions, and they can do things, right? And siloing them actually creates a lot of problems. We need to make sure that if I have a Lambda function that wakes up, or an EC2 instance that wakes up, or a virtual machine in Azure that wakes up and tries to do something, that is really no different than James trying to get into that account to do something. It's a question that needs to be answered right now. Should this be happening or should it not? And having separate solutions, treating these things as separate problems, is a bit of a problem. Couple more additional IAM infrastructure and overhead. This is a legacy concept as well. We see, you're going to mention vaulting. I mentioned vaulting. We see proxy servers, we see bastion hosting, we see additional or tertiary RBAC models being built inside solutions because those were legacy problems that needed to be solved. We didn't have great capabilities from an IAM perspective in the old world. Now we do, but now we've brought these legacy tools with their overlays in, and that just creates this complex nature between what is this role that I'm defining in my PAM solution versus the role that is going to grant them access to when they actually get into the actual cloud itself. That on top of the fact we got a bunch of OS-centric focus based capabilities, agents running around. Like, it's just the cloud doesn't need a lot of this stuff. The cloud has a lot of this built in. What we need are tools that are built to orchestrate the cloud in a much more efficient manner, right? So really, the traditional approach has come from, I know what privilege looks like. I know who has it. I can control them, to I have privilege everywhere. It's strewn across tens of thousands of identities, workloads, humans, third parties, you name it. I need tools that centralize the control back and allow me to lay down privilege control from a central perspective and control both the known and the unknown and bring me into the picture when the unknown starts to rear its ugly head.
You know, you mentioned, having the list of 12 people, right? And being like, these are these are definitely privileged. But
Yeah.
there's also, I mean, like the chart said, I mean, there's thousands of others that can do it. So that's where we get into this. All right, forget about identity centric approaches. Forget about trying to get the list of 12 and saying, well, instead of 12, it's 100 or it's 1,000 or it's because it's really 10,000, right? Shift, flip it around to a privileged centric approach. And we're so hardwired to think about that list view, right? Here's my list of identities. I'm going to certify, I'm going to make sure that they have the right privileges attached to them and say, yep, this one's good, this one's not. There's no way to operationalize that approach at the scale of 10,000 identities with 30,000 policies available to them, right? And chaining these different unique permissions. You just can't build an effective approval process around that. You can't automate it for, all the machine identities. It's just simply too ingrained in the, old world of human centric and admin centric privilege. That's simply not what it is today. So we talk about this privilege centric shift because we think it unlocks sort of all these things you can do on the right and rethink, your way of doing the cloud. One of the things we talk about a lot is, Matt had mentioned, siloing different identities. Well, yeah, if you go from a privilege centric perspective, you no longer have to worry about, well, this is a non-human, this is a third party, this is an AI agent, this is a human, right? All of that doesn't matter. What matters is what they can do. You then can work backwards and say, if you want to put certain corrals around third parties, whatever you can, but securing your main job of saying, hey, privilege in the cloud is secured starts with privilege. So it seems tautological that way, but it is the way to get around some of that scale problem. Now, what you can start to see, if you have this privilege centric approach, you can understand these 19,000 permissions, which ones are sent, and then you need to understand which ones are sensitive because we don't want to trade one scale problem for another. So something that, our research team does is we've looked at every single permission, and in AWS, like we said, it's about 19,000, and we say, does this in any way map to a tactic in the MITRE attack framework? And if it does, we mark it as sensitive and we treat it differently, right? The same way that we used to treat an admin differently, we have to treat a permission differently. And we know, at the scale we're talking about, we have to be able to do this. We have to be able to say some permissions matter more than others. We can't care about them all equally. So instead of thinking about, which identities are privileged, this is sort of the picture of privilege in the cloud. And Matt, you show this to people all the time who are trying to secure their cloud. What's their reaction to this? It's sort of what's their when you kind of make this revelation of, hey, this is what privilege looks like.
Depending on the customer, some really cloud forward customers makes a lot of sense. Other people look at this and say, privilege? I don't quite understand. And I think that that's the part that really resonates with this chart for me. I mentioned before that privilege looks different. You may notice there's no stars on this chart. At most, there's 3 permissions per type of attack, right? When we say privileges everywhere, I get 1 permission from S3, 1 permission from KMS, and 1 permission from Lambda, and I'm allowed to all of a sudden start making a real mess of a cloud. And this is the reality of privilege in a cloud. It's not, yes, you should control your administrative users, yes, but you need to understand that they're not the only thing, nor are they the lion's share of the thing that has privilege in my cloud. And if I can get 2 permissions, I can cause a problem. If I can get 3, in an awful lot of cases, I can do all sorts of damage. And that's what's really interesting about this chart to me. There's no stars. There's no admins here. There's just certain sets of permissions that are not that uncommon to have. But if I get them or I can collect them, I can cause all sorts of problems. And that's why really focusing in on what is privileged in the cloud, controlling the privilege or the access to the privilege does a whole lot of things. It takes away the unknown. If I can control the access to the most privileged actions that can happen in the cloud, I don't care if I know every identity that exists anymore. A new one appears, so what? If I'm controlling the access to the privilege, if it can't get it, it can't use it against me. And so the unknown becomes less of a fear. It just becomes your reality. If it needs it, with the firewall, we'll just reach out and say, hey, this thing's trying to use this thing that it's not been said that it should or should not be able to do. Do you want to grant it access? Yes or no? And we can unlock it and let it go on its merry way. And so it really gives you the scale opportunity as well to tackle both the 18,000 things we're talking about, but across tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of identities very, very quickly.
That's the important thing, is like it feels like a leap of faith probably to some people to be like, you are not going to know what identities can hurt you, and you kind of just need to be comfortable with that, and then you just need to understand, and then you work backwards from,
If
well,
you
do
run the
they have
public cloud, you do not know what identities are going to be a problem for you. You
right?
don't,
I,
and you need
I,
tooling that can step in.
yeah, I think that's the mental block for most people. It's just, again, it feels like your job, right? It's my job to know this is the list, right?
Absolutely.
And it's just to change the nature of the cloud. Anyway, so if you take this privilege centric approach, it unlocks a few different things you can do, and it unlocks a few new use cases you can do at a scale that you could not do before. So Matt's going to show us that in the cloud permissions firewall. I'm going to stop sharing here. Matt's going to bring us in there in a second, and it's really what I want you to think about is I'm not looking for a list of identities anymore. I'm looking for what privileges can hurt me, and how do I make sure I, at scale, have secured my cloud, or have secured privilege in my cloud before I do anything else. Take it away, Matt.
Absolutely. We don't have a lot of time, so I can't go into all of this, but certainly you can see across the top, we call these our hero cards. These are kind of the major themes or use cases we tackle, or we try and tackle off the bat for people. You can see big green buttons: control, quarantine, protect. These are actions, right? The difference with the firewall versus a lot of what you see in traditional, uh, let's call them the C acronym products in the cloud and other solutions, are a lot of visibility. We give enough visibility to drive action. Our goal is to not let you sit there and stare at how bad your cloud is. It's to give you actions that truly start to control that access to those most privileged things. And that can be in the form of limiting access to services, controlling which third parties are there, all the unused identities are roaming around, James mentioned earlier on, but we're going to really focus on the privileged stuff here for today. And I'm just going to use a really quick, concise example here. One service in AWS, like identity and access management, is it a sensitive service? Of course, it's a sensitive service. It's the one that creates identity and grants permission. Does that mean everything that IAM does is sensitive? No, it's not. There's a lot of permissions in IAM that are not wildly privileged. But there are 39, and James did mention the mappings to MITRE and whatnot. This is an activity that we go through, which is to truly categorize and understand every single one of the 18,911. And within that categorization and understanding, which ones are the truly the most privileged, and how do they exist in the cloud, and what entities have them and use them, and what identities have them but don't use them. This number right here, 629, that's the number of overprivileged IAM users and roles in this cloud. Now, an interesting thing with the firewall, that is not identities with a permission that they don't use. That is an identity with a privileged permission that they don't use. So we're not talking about the 18,000 anymore. We're talking about a subset of these permissions that are really, really privileged. They change your cloud. They change how it works. They change how it's configured. They change ingress and egress. They change all of those things that you need to happen, but hopefully you know the identity that's doing them. 629 have those permissions and do not use them. This number is very low because it's a demo environment. Normally, this is in the 1,500, 2,000, 3,000. The highest number I've ever seen is 96,000. And so we're not talking about your Kim alert that says this identity has list buckets and doesn't use it. That's a whole different issue. This identity has create role and doesn't use it. Create VPC, modify security group, you name it, the really sensitive things. If we look at IAM, just to draw the picture very, very accurately, and I always love a demo environment that's deciding to be slow today. That's neat.
That's how you know it's real.
There we go. That's how you know it's live. This is a great example. Again, if we take the actual problems that we see from a privilege perspective at a very, very focused level, then you can see how it multiplies very quickly. I'm looking at one account and one service and 39 specific permissions, 39 of 18,000 in one account in one service. And I have 3 identities, both humans and non-humans. This is important. Remember, the fact that I can create a role is not a human or non-human thing. I don't want a non-human to do it any more than I want a human to do it if it should not be the thing in my cloud doing these activities. So what we do is we unpack what identities have these permissions, 74, and what ones need them, 3. These numbers are quite normal for a real production environment in a cloud. This number ranges between 3 and 7, 8. This number actually can go anywhere between 20 in some really good environments where you see a lot of really good controls being put in place to, I think the most I've ever seen is about 3,500. And that was an SSO problem of a lot of humans getting access to accounts with roles that were wildly overprivileged and uncontrolled. And so this number is really the risk. If I take 74 less 3, I have 71 identities in this account alone. This one account with one service with 39 permissions that can be used against me and should be controlled. Multiply that by number of accounts that you have and numbers of services that you have, and this is how you end up with numbers in the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, approaching 100,000 problems from just a privilege perspective. Our promise, click this protect button. We will basically protect this whole account from an IAM perspective in one button, one click. 3 identities will carry on their merry way. 74 will now have to knock on a door. And we do that all through chat ops, email, things to very quickly get it resolved. This identity is trying to create a role. It's never done it before. Should it happen, we'll reach out, find the right person, say, this is what's happening. Do you want to let it happen? Yes or no? 6 seconds later, it's all resolved. You move on your merry way. And this allows teams to collaborate much quicker from an identity and a privilege perspective and get things resolved without these churns of your policy's wrong. Go change the policy, modify, test, manipulate, promote to stage, test again, promote to prod, you name it. So that's how we really hone in on the privileged perspective and the privileged landscape from a permissions perspective. But we did talk about things like JIT. JIT is another really great concept that does actually harken back to traditional thinking around PAM, but it's actually a very great concept that clouds have made so much better. Clouds are built to deliver JIT, all 3, in fact, in different ways, but they can deliver in a way that's much more seamless than jump boxes bastioning into environments and things like that, secondary RBAC models, all that nonsense. They can be done just by purely orchestrating the cloud's infrastructure that's already there. And that's what the firewall specializes at. So I'll take you very quickly. I did mention those 12 administrators. Again, they're on everyone's mind. We always think about the administrators in our world. Here's your cloud. I can see it on the left. I got accounts, I got OUs, I got the org at the top. This is AWS, but it certainly applies if we jump to any of the other 2 major cloud vendors, or 3, depending on your view. But if I just truly wanted to say, I need to make sure that my administrators are controlled and I know when they're going in and they have no privilege outside of a granted session with the firewall, that's pretty freaking easy. They're all in the administrator group. If that's what you've named it, if you've named it my power users, if you've named it my special administrators, whichever. 2 clicks later, and I've basically taken the administrators, every single one of them, and I've stated, yesterday you were able to log directly into that account and do that job. Tomorrow you still can. The difference is we're going to ask you in Slack, do you mean to? And then we're going to go get an approval, and then we're going to unlock you in about 10 seconds. And it was 2 clicks, right? That's the difference with a solution that's built from a cloud native perspective versus I'm going to run a 6-month program to deploy a JIT platform in my world. I'm going to go through and redefine all my RBAC in this JIT platform. I'm going to set up all the extra infrastructure that I'm going to manage. And then lo and behold, later on, I've now got my administrators going in and they're now time boxed. Or I could do it in 2 clicks with the Cloud Permissions Firewall. And so that's how we've taken what the clouds offer us. We're a consumer as well, offer us from a capability perspective, and turned it into a cloud PAM that's actually effective, operates at scale, solves the privilege problem in cloud, and still allows you to bring along some of the concepts like our worry about these 12 administrators. I now have my 12 administrators locked behind 0 standing privilege when they're not in that account, and a JIT approval and a full summary of what they've done when they're in that account. And I did it all in about 5 seconds, as you saw. So James, that's a really quick demo. I'd love anybody through. Sorry, go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say, and you're doing it basically without an additional IAM infrastructure. So the way you're enforcing that is through existing AWS policies and IAM tools.
Yes, as I said, the clouds have fantastic capabilities. Sometimes they're esoteric. Sometimes it can be scary. All right, if I go and write an SCP and drop it in, it's the AWS going to do exactly what I asked. So making sure that what's in that SCP matches my intent, that's really important, and that's what we do for you. That's our magic. We make sure that when we build out the infrastructure that goes into the cloud, it matches what you asked for. It matches the usage of your cloud. It matches the identities that are supposed to have that access versus the ones that are not. And then we make sure we get it in a seamless fashion in a way that causes zero disruption. And then as things need to change, for instance, somebody was in my health automation yesterday as administrator, and today they try to go in. The difference to them today over yesterday is they get a Slack message, they get an approval, and then they're in. The disruption, we're talking seconds. And the actual management overhead and friction of deploying this style of a solution versus some of the other solutions you see in that sort of come from a traditional perspective on these types of capabilities, much more additional infrastructure in addition to the IAM infrastructure that the clouds already provide. So it's just a whole lot more work and a whole lot more health and care and feeding than something like the cloud permissions firewall.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there, James.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was great. Like Matt said, that was a brief introduction. There is a lot more in the Cloud Permissions Firewall. Just as a quick plug, we would love to show you more. If you take this concept of the privilege-centric approach and you treat identities as is appropriate based on their access to privilege, not their immutable characteristics, you get the ability to do a bunch of cool things. Whether it is, like Matt said, doing the granting back with JIT and what we call privilege on demand, but also, do you want to disable access to a service or a region, right? Do you want an off button for Amazon Bedrock in this organization? Well, you can do that now, right? If you're working on the permissions directly, the privileges, not the people. So there's a bunch of cool stuff you can do there, and we'd love to show you more. And absolutely, we're gonna give you a link to our free trial here at the end. Right now, I want to pause and just make sure we cover any questions. We only have a couple minutes. We want to wrap up here in about 3 minutes. But if you have any questions, please submit them. If we don't get to them today, we will look at them later and respond to you over email. The first thing, Matt, is a kind of a class of questions, which is like, you're talking about you don't need vaulting and a couple of these other things. It's people are a little incredulous, saying, "Are you telling me I don't need a vault anymore?" As one sort of representative, I don't think that's quite what you're saying, though.
I'm not saying you don't need a vault. I am saying I'm confused sometimes when people bring in a third party vault. Clouds all have vaults, so they're great vaults. What I am saying is, and we've all seen these in attacks. I won't name the attacks, but it's really unfortunate when I can find my way into the vault, and because I'm in the vault, I can actually become a class of administrator in your cloud. Um, humans humans in clouds should gain access. I won't say in one way, but in a certain type of way. I should be SSO'd with multi-factor into my ecosystem that is my corporate environment, and then from there I should be able to JIT into an environment to become an escalated amount of privilege to do what I need to get done. The clouds have solved the problem of short-lived rotating credentials. We don't need vaults to be, or our external tools to be generating short-lived external credentials for identities operating in our clouds. That does not need to happen. Are vaults going to exist for a while? They absolutely will, because we will have secrets, and secrets need to be stored. It's the type of secrets that are in there should be definitely recategorized or reevaluated as you move into a cloud world and you truly adopt cloud and you adopt cloud PAM principles. Humans should be treated certainly in a way that removes their need for that type of infrastructure. And those should be limited to, yes, you will have an integration that comes from a third party and they're going to do it through an IAM user. And hopefully you can protect that key and you're going to put it in a vault and away you go. But it's really putting things in context. Don't use a vault for the reasons you use a vault 10 years ago. Use a vault for the reasons that they need to be used in cloud today, and use cloud tools to solve the other problems. Don't bring those older concepts forward.
Mm. Yeah. Got it. Other questions around machine identities. So you showed JIT,
Yep.
you showed an approval process and talked about, going through Slack and Teams. That in of itself, right, feels like it's for humans. So how are you handling, or is there within Sonrai? I know you said, don't silo, types of identities, but what about granting those permissions back to, a machine identity, a build role over here that's not tied to a single person?
Wouldn't it be fantastic if I had workload identities that had more permissions than they needed, privileged permissions, and they were blocked from using them until a human stepped in and said, maybe that workload should be creating networks. Right? Yeah, we do that too, and that is the removal of the silo. With humans, we tend to call it JIT. With non-humans, we tend to call it permissions on demand. We have an identity. It's got access because of grants to all the wild permissions, and we're protecting it. We're saying you don't do these things. You don't need access to these things. But the one day that it tries, one of two things has happened. It's supposed to, and the workload's trying to do its job because somebody told it to, or asked it to, or a trigger caused it to happen, or another thing's happening, which is something got a hold of that workload and is trying to use the identity associated to it to do something that it shouldn't because it just happens to have some beautiful permissions they want access to. In that kind of scenario for a non-human or workload, the right thing to do is what we do, which is reach out to the people who own those parts of the cloud and say, wait a minute, this identity, which you've told us does not do these things and should not be doing these things, is trying to do these things. Do you want to let it happen? Yes or no? And at a click of a button in Slack, Teams, and email through the UI, you can unlock that in about 6 seconds. Or you can ask the question, why the heck is that happening? And you probably or often have stopped something that shouldn't be occurring in your environment. And when I say stop, I mean, you're not waiting for your, I don't know, your EDR to tell you that something was exfiltrated. You're stopping it when it actually occurred before the actual event even operated or even was successful. So it looks an awful lot like a JIT for a non-human. And it's again a great place where the cloud permissions firewall dissolves those boundaries and treats the privileged access the way it should be treated, which is something is trying to do a privileged activity. Should it be happening? Yes or no?
Got it. Thanks. Yeah, so it's that same flow is basically available, right? You're still working through Slack and Teams. You're still the same principle of we're not we're trying to work where you're working. It's just it also
With
works for machine identities,
with
just slightly.
expediency being the real goal. Expediency
Yeah.
is the goal. We're not attempting to put a bunch of blocks around what people are trying to get done. What we are trying to say is when a non-human in an environment that it's operated in for an extended period of time all of a sudden changes its behavior, it's probably a good idea for a human that's relatively knowledgeable of that environment to get involved and say that makes sense or it doesn't. And with a click of a button, we give it back.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt. That's all the time we have for Q&A today. Really appreciate your time. And if you want to see more about the firewall, please check out. We do have a free trial where you can play around for 2 weeks and do a bunch of new stuff. We have new controls around third-party access. We've, like I said, shutting off regions and services, quarantining, zombie identities, all those use cases you didn't see today. Please check us out there. And if you want to connect with Matt, he's on LinkedIn. Right? So please reach out to me or him to learn more. We're always happy to talk more about IAM and identity. Matt, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And until next time, everybody, happy happy hunting in your cloud, and I hope you stay secure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.